Today's Hiwatt soundbite is all about capturing a killer drum sound. Oh man, there's nothing like capturing live drums off the floor, particularly when that drummer's got a little bit of attitude behind that performance. Or what about this vibe? And another killer groove. Well, that recording represents one of literally hundreds of bed track drum recordings that I've made over my career. This particular recording is one of my all-time faves. I love the sound of this performance and the way it was recorded. So for today's session, I want to break down this drum sound a little bit and take a few minutes and share some critical techniques that I've learned over 30 plus years of tracking drums in how to obtain and capture and produce a better drum sound. Well, of course, a lot of the music that I'm sharing on my channel is electronic based and therefore almost entirely programmed with either drum machines or samples. But as a recording engineer and producer, you've got to learn the chops to be able to go in the studio and capture a killer drum sound, to capture a drum sound that will carry you all the way through to the end of that project in the mix. There are just certain genres and styles of music that don't really loan themselves to being re-triggered and all sampled up. Some bands are going to come across as way more authentic if you've got that real drum kit coming off the floor. When I got started in this business over 30 years ago, most of the bands that I got assigned to early were those late night acts, bands that could only afford the kind of midnight to 8 a.m. shift. I have no idea how many bed track drum recordings I did in the first 10 years of my career, but I promise you, a lot of those recordings were just terrible. I used to struggle getting drum sounds. Well, it took years for me to learn an absolute secret of getting a killer drum sound. It's all about the drummer. Oh man, when a drummer comes in the studio and sets their drum kit up and tunes it, and then proceeds to sit down and play off those drums, there are just certain drummers that can sit down and make drums sing. It's unbelievable. And as a recording engineer, when that happens, it's so easy to get a drum sound. You just throw mics up in front of stuff and it just works. Going back and thinking 30 years ago, all that struggle and, me feeling and believing that I could engineer my way to a good drum sound. Absolutely not. In my own personal experience, a killer drum sound always starts with a killer drummer. There's just about nothing that you can do to magically correct or engineer your way to a good drum sound. It's got to start with a really good drummer with tuned drums. Well, there's one area of recording drums early on that I sort of really had to get my head around. When I came fresh out of recording school, there was a real emphasis put on isolation, to be able to go in and isolate each one of those sounds. For any of you who have gone into the studio and actually listened to what a drum kit sounds like when it's being played, you know that there's no way that you're going to keep that snare drum out of all those other mics. That snare drum is 3 times louder than anything else on that drum kit. When I finally got my head around this idea of stop trying to isolate everything so much and start buying into the idea that that snare drum that's showing up in all these other mics needs to be part of my sound, instead of trying to eliminate it and isolate it, just buy into the fact that that freaking snare drum is going to be on every track you record, period, no matter what. So dial it in, figure out how to make that leakage work within that kit. So this is a major discovery I made, and it really goes against a lot of the theory and so on that I had learned in school. Isolating all of those drum sounds is a great idea in theory, but the reality is when you start to actually get your hands on recording, you realize that it's just about impossible. That snare drum is so loud that it just shows up everywhere. And when I finally bought into that and owned it, my drum sounds really started to improve. Well, this will be fun. For those of you who have not had the experience of being in the studio and listening to a live drum kit, I'm gonna go ahead and bypass the compressor that I've got on a mono room that I have recorded. We're gonna solo this up. Let's listen to what the drums sound like in the room with no processing. This is just a microphone sitting in the middle of the room. Check it. Well, there's evidence of it, right? That snare drum is 4 times louder than anything else in that kit. There's nothing wrong with that snare being sort of out of balance in the sound of that mono room mic. Why? Because I know that I'm gonna slam this mono room with serious compression, extreme and excessive compression. So the fact that the snare drum is like way louder than anything else in the kit is only gonna help me when it comes to that compression factor. Check out what I'm talking about. I'm gonna go ahead and play this mono room one more time, totally unprocessed, just as it came off the floor that day. And now with the compressor inserted. Yeah, once you actually apply some extreme compression to that sound, that snare drum is no longer blazing loud anymore. It sort of balances itself out in a really good way. Well, another area that this applies to big time are the tom drums. I used to go to so much effort to eliminate the snare out of those tom mics. Things like putting gates on those toms, actually putting gates on while I'm tracking. Yeah, I don't recommend you ever do that. Turn those gates off when you're tracking. Definitely. Don't screw up that performance by having a gate close when it's not supposed to close, right? Let's go ahead and solo this subgroup that I've got my 4 tom mics on. Check this. Yeah, there's a ton of snare leakage in those tom mics, but the snare is part of the drum kit. Some of the beef in the chest of that snare drum is coming from the leakage in those tom mics. When I mute the toms, I miss a certain element of that snare drum sound. And this is true with all of my tracks. There's a ton of snare drum, obviously, in the overhead mics. And a lot of the snare drum sound that I dial in my final mix comes from that combination, right? When I mute any one of those elements, the snare drum sound changes, and usually in a bad way. Well, I love pushing really hot tom levels in my mix, so occasionally the leakage of snare drum that's in those toms can start to be a bit of a problem when you're really pushing them. Well, when this happens, the simple solution for me is to just go ahead and automate about 3 dB of gain reduction on those tom tracks. In this case, I've got 4 tom tracks subgrouped to a bus. So I just take the bus track and I lower the level of that bus by 3 dB anytime those toms are not playing. Check it. In my own experience, you don't have to be fancy with these moves. You can literally just push and pull, and of course, cut rhythmically to hide those moves. Killer performance, and I love that drum sound. Nate, what's up, my friend? I didn't just whip this drum sound together in like a couple hours. I spent the majority of an entire day setting this band up. Well, this leads to one of the most important discoveries I've made in capturing a killer performance from a band. Book an extra day for setup. Period. Stop trying to record that band when you finally got your act together as an engineer and you got all your sounds together. You know, back in the day, I was forced into this just because of lack of budgets, right? The band would come in and I often had to start setting up at midnight and be finished everything, including the mix, by 8 a.m. So yeah, there were no options. For the last 20 years, every single time I've gone into the studio to do a live recording, I've booked an extra day of setup so that the band can come in and everyone can just relax. All we're doing on the first day is just setting up. More often than not, I'm about to spend 4 or 5 days in the studio with that band cutting bed tracks. So there's no way I'm gonna rush to get to a drum sound. And it's just so I can hurry up and get recording on that first day. I would way rather take my time in the studio and dial all those sounds in, get everyone's headphone mixes to where they're really comfortable with it. It'll make all the difference in the performances you get from your musicians. And then finally, when you're finally at the end of that long, big, huge setup day, send everybody home and have everyone come back the next day fresh and ready to record. What a difference that makes. Well, let's take a minute and solo the individual sounds so we can hear how they all come together. Check this. Well, thank you very much for sitting in on today's session. And I hope this session inspires you to think outside the box a little bit. You know, a lot of the things that we learn in recording school and the theory out of books is just there as a guideline, right? Just so important to remember that there are no rules in this business, just results.